So I want to take a moment and just discuss what the plate margins mean, and active versus passive plate margins. So we learned that we can define our plate margins by looking at the geology. And our plate margins are going to kind of look something like this. Let's see, here's the water level. So if we want to define our plate margins from here to say right about here, this is what we call the continental shelf. This is where you would go swimming, right? If you go out to Biloxi and you go swimming at the beach, you're swimming out on the shelf. Now, from the edge of the shelf to say right about here, this is what we call the slope. That's what we call the drop-off. Now, what's important about the slope is the edge of the slope right here. This is actually the true edge of the continent. We do not define the edge of the continent by where the beach is, because the beach is going to move. If sea level gets higher, the beach will move this way. If sea level gets lower, the beach will go this way. So we do not define the edge of our plate by where the beach is. However, we actually define this is where the true edge of our plate is, right there. And we're actually going to see why here in a few minutes when we talk about our active plate boundaries. But to finish defining, right here you see that bump of sediment. Okay, that's what we call the rise. Because what happens is sediment gets washed out into the ocean, it flows down the shelf, it tumbles down the slope, and it gets deposited right at the base. And then way out here, this is the abyssal plain, the big, deep part of the ocean. So I want to talk about the differences between an active and a passive margin. So in a passive margin, we have no active geology. There are no earthquakes, there are no volcanoes, there's really not a lot going on. So if you want a good analogy or a good idea of where we have a passive margin, this is going to be our Atlantic coast. What we see is that full suite that we just talked about, right? We see our shelf, we see our slope, our rise, and our abyssal plain, right? We see all the features of a margin at a passive boundary. However, at an active boundary, this is where we have lots of geology. We see earthquakes, and we see volcanoes. So what's really going on here is what we have is we've got the edge of our plate, right, there's my shelf and my slope, and what we have is our ocean plate is actually doing what we're about to learn here is what we call subducting. Right, so my ocean plate is actually moving this way, and my continental plate is moving this way. So let's think about this, right? Here I have my shelf, here I have my slope, but all that sediment that's coming down here and falling down the slope, if it gets deposited, it's going to get sucked right under. So we cannot develop a continental rise. And the abyssal plain, well, it's also getting sucked underneath. So we're not developing an abyssal plain. So an active plate boundary, or an active plate margin, only has the shelf and the slope. And now maybe you can see why we define the edge of the continent as right here, because that's where subduction occurs. It occurs right at the base of the slope. So hopefully that kind of clarified a little bit the difference there between the active and the passive margin.